Good afternoon, and welcome to this COVID-19 Climate Change and Wellbeing webinar from the Sustainable Business Network. I'm Andy Kemmerly from the Sustainable Business Network. I'll be guiding you through this 1 hour session through your lunch break. Thanks very much for joining us and spending this time with us. We've got about 300 plus people who are signed up, so there's a few folk out there ready and keen to listen in. Today's webinar has been brought together by 3 of SBN's partners: Auckland District Health Board, the University of Auckland, and the Medical Assurance Society. These organisations are at the forefront of our health system and are committed to sustainable healthcare, doing no harm to people and the environment. So we're going to hear from 3 great speakers this morning on this subject. First off, we've got Rachel Brown, who is the founder and CEO of the Sustainable Business Network and my boss. She'll be talking about what the lessons can be learned from the current situation and how they might inform how we address the wider impacts from climate change, addressing inequality, redistributing wealth, and regenerating nature. Second up, we have got Dr. Nikki Hare, Professor in Psychology, University of Auckland. She's also author of the award-winning book, The Infinite Game. She's going to look at the issues around equality. Are we able to provide well-being for all, and who pays for it in these times? Are we willing to redistribute the wealth generated and lost by this pandemic? And are we willing to see winners and losers? Or are we going to provide only the bare minimum to those at the bottom while the winners keep all their wealth? Finally, Dr. David Galler, intensive care specialist from Counties Monaco District Health Board, author of NZ bestseller, Things That Matter, Stories of Life and Death. He's going to bring us his unique perspectives on the ways that this disruptive pandemic has amplified existing vulnerabilities in our society and personally exposed new ones, highlighting the precarious nature of how we've chosen to live life and what we value. So buckle up. It's going to be a good session. What I'd like you to do is pump in answers, questions for the Q&A session at the end into the Q&A box down below. I'll be marching us through that after the speeches themselves. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Rachel Brown, ONZM, founder and CEO of the Sustainable Business Network. Rachel.
Kia ora. Thank you so much for your wonderful introduction there, Andy. Yeah, so I thought I would kick this off really briefly outlining a little bit about the intensity of the climate change issues that we're at, talk a little bit about the impact of COVID that we've had, and then kind of lean into that idea of hope and trust and the importance for that in our general well-being. So this is kind of framing quite broadly. I come certainly from an organisational angle, so I'll go through that now. So first of all, 3 things I'm going to cover: what's going on with climate change, just to remind us and set the scene. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the push for change that's been going on and it's still wanted, but the impact that COVID has brought in, some good, some bad. And then remind us at the end that redistribution and regeneration are things that are actually very possible. It's just a matter of doing it. So that's kind of the framing of my conversation. So first of all, I'll start just reminding us about New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. Most of them come from the agricultural sector. It's about half of it. The rest essentially comes from energy use. Most of that is to do with road transport and energy across manufacturing, construction, etc., and waste. And just also remind us pre-COVID that our emissions, gross emissions and net emissions, were both still on a massive rise. At the same time, we've been experiencing now some of the impacts of climate on New Zealand. We're in the middle of a drought right now, which is just what climate is doing as it's changing and it's playing out in real form, and we're experiencing it. It's a reminder that we still need to change what we do. So what we're really keen on is talking about a redistribution of wealth and of opportunity, but also a movement to a regeneration of nature and natural systems to try and respond to that. It's really important to also remember that last year was a really vocal year. We had the beautiful activation from Greta Thunberg and the movement of young people asking us, demanding us actually, that we unite behind science and we really start to act on climate now. There is a real problem for our young people with eco-anxiety growing, and this is only growing because of our inaction and not doing things at the scale and pace that we really need them to. 2020 was a year we thought we were going to get a lot of stuff really cranking here in New Zealand. As an organisation, we were gearing up for a lot of action on climate, on things like redesigning the way that our systems work for addressing waste. We were looking at massive scale restoration of our waterways and how we regenerate our Hauraki Gulf and other gulfs because we're an island nation. There was a lot of good stuff coming forward. But then COVID hit. And COVID has been a fascinating experience for us as a nation. We very quickly started queuing and fighting over flour and toilet paper. And then we also noticed that we got, as we got into lockdown, that there were a lot of positive things for New Zealand. Our motorways cleared up, the skies cleared up, our waterways were much more pleasant, and it was quieter. There was a beautiful video that it made its way around called Papatuanuku is Breathing. I don't know how many of you would have seen it, but if you haven't, Google it. It's beautiful, just reflecting what COVID actually did for us. And we got to hang on to that. We connected with our neighbourhoods and we massively reduced our carbon emissions by some 25% over that time period. So we can do these things when we have to. We just have to make sure that there's a fair distribution as we go through this, because walking around any city now in New Zealand, we're seeing more and more homelessness. We know that people are not paid enough to feed their kids decent meals. There's a real problem with the redistribution of wealth. So pre-COVID and through COVID, we know the business as usual model was broken. Essentially, it was unsustainable then, and unless we change it, it's still going to be unsustainable moving forward. But the really good news, which is also extraordinarily frustrating, is that we actually know what we need to do right now. We know the solutions, and I'm going to talk you through 5 really quickly of those solutions that we have. But these solutions are based around this belief that if we actually act on these issues that we're all pointing to, climate, waste, water, and distribution of wealth, we will rebuild trust in our systems, which currently have real trust issues, but we also build hope, which in a community which is currently needing that to happen, I think is essential. We also have to remind ourselves that we are part of the system, so blaming others is just not useful. So one of the things we have to focus on is what's the role that I play in my either organisation I work for, in the wider community system, but also what's the role I play in regenerating natural systems, because we all actually must act. So the 5 things. 1 is that we have to return to localisation. It's just making sense. We have to regenerate our food system, and there are a million ways of doing that, focusing on the soil, going organic, and changing the foods that we eat to more plant-based diets. That's 1. We have to make sure that we are formally using restoration as a sector that we invest in, and that is already coming through with government with their $1.1 billion investment in the space, but we can do that better and make sure it's seen as an actual sector here. We need to shift mobility. We were doing that beautifully during COVID. We have to stick to it. We have to invest in it. We learned how to do digitization. We're doing it right now, but we also have to invest in a new set of solutions that move us out of this addiction to fossil fuel-based transport. We have to move to moving transport, mobility, and getting into electrification where we can. It has to be affordable. It has to be accessible. We have to invest in green cities and buildings. We need to stop treating our water like places that we push our rubbish out into the sea. We have to embrace this back into the way that we design our cities, green buildings, green water infrastructure. It's just all part of that solution set. And then we need to think about how we design pretty much everything from our product packaging through to the products and services that we sell, so that we've got a sharing economy. We have more stuff than the world can deal with already. So how do we make sure we utilize those resources better while they're on the land? We also have a massive opportunity to build science around things like bioplastics to get away from this addiction to fossil fuels. So that's kind of 5 things that New Zealand could lead on. And I think we could do a fabulous job of this. It's all up to us and our ability to want to bloody well do it. And I think that's my key points, Andy.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rachel. Awesome. It seems there's obviously plenty of work for everyone. There's a challenge for everyone and plenty for us to do. So just a reminder for your questions and for the panel, if you can put them on the Q&A. Keep them pretty concise because I've got to read off the screen and try and bring them to the team live as we go. So, but that'd be fantastic. Keep them rolling as we go. So I'll just bring in now Nikki Hare, who's a professor from the University of Auckland of Psychology and an author, and bring her insights into how this might change the way that our mindsets might work and how that might change the big bad world out there. Nikki, welcome.
Thank you, Andy, and kia ora koutou. I'm going to discuss 2 basic ideas. First, what research on children's cooperation can teach us about managing and recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. And second, how we can use our own insights from the level 4 lockdown to plan for organisations better equipped to promote human and ecological flourishing. So first up, the research. There's a huge body of research that shows young children from the age of about 18 months or so are good at helping others. For example, if an adult is using and then drops a pen, a young child is likely to pick up that pen and pass it to the adult. Chimpanzees are also good at this. A young adult chimpanzee might help an older, frailer chimpanzee climb to a desired spot. But what neither chimpanzees nor very young children are so good at is sharing. Give them a delicious piece of food and they're likely to eat it all themselves, even in the presence of an onlooker who clearly wants part of the action. However, as children, human children grow, this changes. By the age of about 3 years, children tend to share the efforts of collaborative tasks, even if the prize happens to land in their lap alone. By 4 years old, children become very concerned about fairness. If they're playing with another child and that child's given 4 lollies and they're only given 2 lollies, they're likely to get extremely upset, even to the point of not being interested in the lollies they actually do have. By 8 years old, though, something really interesting happens. Children become uncomfortable with inequality that advantages them. If 2 children are playing together and there are 6 lollies up for grabs, both children would rather they each got 3 than that they themselves got, 4 or 5 and the other child got only 1 or 2. So bringing us back to grown-ups and recovery from the pandemic, I think we need to take a lesson for children and remember about sharing. I think we were great at helping during the lockdown, shopping for older relatives, observing the rules of social distancing, following Jacinda Ardern's plea with us to be kind. But what about sharing? What about giving up some of the stuff that happened to land in our laps so that other people get their share of the incredible abundance that Rachel's already alluded to, that we cooperatively, collectively generate in this country? As I understand it, I looked this up, New Zealand produces enough food to feed 40 million people. I actually think it's tragic that we'd increase the national debt burden for future generations to pay off because we adults haven't figured out or have perhaps forgotten how to share. As a start, Jacinda, please put up my taxes. To my second point. I'm really intrigued by the different experiences people had during and post-lockdown and the insights that provides about what's really needed for people to flourish, individuals and families and communities and as a nation. So I'm going to put some questions to you and they're all based around this central question. What kind of person did you become in lockdown? So perhaps just think about this as I go through them. First, did you feel happier, healthier, more integrated, or maybe the reverse? Less happy, less healthy, less integrated. Were you anxious? And if so, what exactly was that about? How did you get on with the people you lived with? Who did you miss? If anyone, be honest, you're only answering these questions in your own head. Did you feel more aware of the natural world, of birds, trees, wind, and so on? Or maybe you felt confined in an urban space that was somehow limiting and closed in. What was the feeling on the streets around you? Did you feel more or less connected to the people you saw? And what seemed to be behind that sense of connection or disconnection? What did you long to be able to do when we were all released, if anything? Again, be honest. And if you did do that thing, what was it like? Was it how you had imagined and expected it to be? And when you got back into circulation, what, again, if anything, seemed like a burden? Oh, here we go, this again. For me personally, lockdown was basically a gift, and it brought out the best in me. I was worried about the economy, at least jobs and companies closing, all that kind of thing. In fact, I have to admit it gave me a really new respect for the idea of the economy, because it brought home to me how dependent we've become on the exchange of multiple and varied goods and services. And this involves people's livelihoods, and it gives people a role and a sense of contribution to society, all of which are crucial to well-being. My husband and son couldn't work, and I found it really hard to give up swimming. But the simplicity of the situation, knowing I was under no obligation to catch up with anyone, I didn't have to attend any events, I didn't have clashing invitations that I had to choose between, that I knew exactly how many people would be home for dinner every night, but I didn't have to get my hair cut, still haven't done that, or go to the dentist. It really felt as if something that was a permanent grind and discomfort in my life, and sort of made me feel a bit icky about myself a lot of the time, had vanished. I also found I got on better with other people in my household. I was living with my husband and a fairly grown-up daughter and son. And it really surprised me, because I thought they'd be more annoying if I was spending all the time with them. But somehow they were less annoying, which was an unexpected outcome. I love the quality of our streets. It reminded me of when I visited Utrecht in the Netherlands. And what struck me so much was that the streets were busy and full of life, but quiet, because there were so few cars. So the person I became in lockdown was basically more serene and more patient. I had a clearer routine that didn't seem to be constantly disrupted. And I think the overall term for it is I felt integrated. So basically coming out of lockdown for me felt like quite a burden. But the most important bit of it, because I've thought a lot about this, is that it introduced me again to this choice, to this feeling of constantly letting other people down because of the pull from all these different networks I was involved in. I also felt I should spend money, but I actually didn't want to buy anything. I even had this idea I should give some random person $200 a week and say, here, spend it for me. Not on me, but for me, so that I'm doing my bit to revive the economy. The psychologist Barry Schwartz has written about what he calls a paradox of choice. And he suggests that freedom of choice is a two-edged sword, for just on the other side of liberation sits chaos and paralysis. And I think we live in the world I live in, and the world many of us live in which I make a lot of choices and the people around me have to make a lot of choices, ends up being enormously fractured, the opposite from that integration that I felt during lockdown. It's like we're all connected to these multiple different networks, and so A, getting us together in the first place is difficult, and second, when you manage to do it, it's almost like you can feel the sort of tension of people being pulled in multiple directions. This does not lead to deep, integrated, important conversations between us. And I don't think this, I want to really stress here that I don't think this insight about my own life, that I felt integrated in lockdown with the simplicity of it and now fractured, that we're back in life as usual. I don't want to say that this provides a solution for me. So the suggestion that I could give things up, I could stop going to my ballet class or say no to invitations, that's not a solution. That doesn't change the circumstance. It doesn't change that sort of ickiness inside me. They manage a situation, but I'm suggesting the COVID lockdown gives us potential to really rethink the situation. And to add injury to these fractured lives, these multiple networks, all of this is terrible for the environment. We travel too much, we consume too much, we waste too much food, and so on. I know many of us realised in lockdown just how little of all of that you can do and actually still have a life. So there's sort of two things here. One is, I think this is kind of insight, if you like, about fractured lives. But the other thing is, even more fundamentally, I'm really inviting everyone to think carefully about what lockdown was like and what post-lockdown they realised about their lives. This kind of moment of experiential insight into how to be a person in a different kind of way. It wasn't intellectual, we felt it. I had no idea I'd get on better with my family. and using those insights to have these collective, really deep conversations about the kind of lives we want to live. Now, Rachel mentioned she was interested in organisations. I am too. I think organisations are really great places for making change because we can do it collectively. It's not on the individual to do something, but they're small enough so we can have a bit of control. So if we got together in our organisations and discussed the kinds of questions that I just posed to you then, I think we could think deeply about what we need to be happy and healthy together and what in theory could be stripped away. We can't do it as individuals, we have to do it together. And I want to just briefly contrast this with a lot of the post-COVID planning, which seems to be, to me, pretty superficial and based on not a very well thought through idea of what works. So Zoom works. It's working well now, I hope. Working from home works for some, but at what cost do all these things bring to our sense of community? I'm really worried that the ideology of choice, which is so endemic in contemporary culture, can guide decision-making in times like these. For example, at the university, we're going for, students having more choice in how they get their lectures, online or in person and so on. And this really worries me that we're putting the onus on individuals in a way that's not going to be good for creating community. I think we need to think collectively, but I think that thinking has to come from what it means to be a human being and from our experiences and the opportunity this post-COVID recovery has to have deep conversations about what matters and our collective commitment to creating the structures of Forward What Matters. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nikki. That's a very deep and rich look at the issues around integration of a personality and the choices that we make collectively and individually. Just to say, that's looking at how rich that was. We've also recording this. You can go back on Facebook and look through it. So if you want to do that really interesting personal quiz yourself in your own time, that's a perfect chance for you to take that on. I can see that some more people have joined us. So just to say, we're looking at climate change, well-being, and COVID-19 and the kind of changes we can make and need to make as we go forward. Keep those questions coming in. We've got a few coming in now, which is great. On the Q&A there, we'll have a panel discussion at the end where we can start to throw this stuff around between the experts that we have. Next up, David Galler, author, intensive care person. He's been at all ends of the life's kind of experiences and written intensively on them. So we should get some really interesting insights from David. David, welcome.
Thank you very much, Andy. Kia ora koutou. Thanks to the SBN for the series of webinars and this opportunity to present. If there was to be a title for this talk, it could be Climate Change, Healthcare and Health in a COVID-19 World. Or perhaps it could be something else like Plus ça change, plus le même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. This pandemic, as overwhelming as it is, will pass, and before too long there will be another. More than anything, it has shone a light on many of the vulnerabilities in society and the precarious nature of our existence, our jobs, our supply chains, but particularly how we have chosen to live so out of sync with the planet. And of course, like other global threats like climate change, it'll be the disadvantaged who will suffer most. As numerous commentators have pointed out, this is also a time ripe with opportunity. But to make the most of that, it will need much more from us than we have been prepared to give to date. We need to organize, be totally strategic in our thinking and planning, and relentless in our endeavor to get the outcomes we want. Some of you will have seen the film 2040, a film that looked at 5 existing relatively simple interventions that, if adopted worldwide, would radically alter the trajectory of global warming. Rachel mentioned her 5, there was some crossover. The big question for me from that film was why we have chosen not to adopt those interventions. The answer, I think, is because of the power of vested interests and our inability to advocate more strategically and powerfully for change, to tell the inspiring stories of what a better future might actually look like. If there are any takeaway messages from my short kōrero, I think it's this. Governments tend to underestimate the support for change and overestimate the opposition to it. We need focused leadership, advocacy, and action to design and build the future we want for our children and theirs that follow. I work in South Auckland for County's Manukau Health. We employ 9,000 people and serve a population of well over 600,000 of our most vulnerable people. Despite that, it is a place that is rich in many ways, with many outstanding communities who do extraordinary things. But in my mind, that place has for too long been abandoned to the fast food chains, liquor stores, and pokie machines. South Auckland is home to a high proportion of young people. Many there move from one overcrowded house to the next, from one GP to another, and the kids from one school to another. It is also a place where many suffer from the South Auckland full house, a six-carded hand that includes obesity, diabetes, renal impairment, ischemic heart disease, hypertension, and gout. It rates far higher than the general population. From a pure healthcare point of view, the population of South Auckland are the most complex in the country, and their access to services and cycle lanes is far less than that in smaller, affluent, mainly Pākehā cities like Christchurch, Dunedin, and Wellington. It is this issue of inequity and poor value that in the last 5 years has become the focus of our carbon reduction group. But before we go there, a quick story. Our carbon reduction journey at Counties Manukau started in 2011, thanks to a small group of hospital staff who understood the great threat climate change posed to human health. In fact, years later, the Lancet billed climate change as the greatest threat to human health in the 21st century. Counties was the first healthcare organisation in Australasia to join Enviromark's CMAR scheme in 2011, and at our last audit in September 2019, we had reduced our carbon footprint by 26%, despite significant growth in both the volume of our work and the volume of our staff. Now 12 other DHBs have become members of Toitu EnviroCare, and together our advocacy through the Sustainable Health Sector National Network has grown as too have our savings in carbon, largely through picking off the low-hanging fruit in the fields of energy, waste, and travel. Just by way of background, healthcare contributes between 3 to 10% of a nation's greenhouse gas emission profiles, probably in New Zealand about 6, although it's never really been measured. About 60% of that is related to procurement, and specifically to the life cycle carbon costs of the devices and pharmaceuticals we use and prescribe every day. So despite all our good work, even if we were to have a totally energy neutral facility, healthcare's footprint would still be substantial. What is clear though is that healthcare's carbon footprint will be reduced if we do less work. I'm not saying that we should not treat those that need it or will benefit from treatment, but to invest more of our thinking, planning, and doing in keeping people well. Health and well-being are not created in doctors' offices or in hospitals, but where they live and how they live. I am an intensive care doctor, but I know that for most people who end up with me, they do so because of an embedded series of failures beforehand. We call these the social determinants of health, which account for over 80% of our overall population health status. And it is those that have become the focus of our carbon reduction group. We have developed a worldview which has helped us in our thinking and how we have redefined our carbon reduction work as health and well-being initiatives. What's good for the environment is good for health, and vice versa. What's good for health is always good for the environment. The trajectory of planetary health and population health are the same. We rise and we fall together. Doing all those things we can to keep people well and keeping individuals, families, and whole populations well depends on the health of the planet that sustains us. So more and more of our thinking and efforts are turned to a kind of regenerative practice to improve our functional ecosystems, build ever stronger social networks, whilst at the same time creating economic opportunity. When I was thinking about this talk, mindful of the need to look forward, I found myself looking back to reflect on some of the enduring truths of our First Nation that have guided me through my career in intensive care medicine. Because what we are doing here is rediscovering what we have lost, looking back to look forward. Many of you will be familiar with Mason Jury's model of Māori health. It's called Te Whare Tapawha, the house of 4 posts. It paints a holistic picture of health and well-being that is much more than just physical health. It includes the well-being of the whānau, the family, the mind, and the spirit. But health and wellness are not ends in themselves. For another Indigenous group, the 4 great tribes in the Canadian province of British Columbia, Health and wellness sit alongside other enablers like decent housing, a good education, employment, and more to create a foundation for their people, individuals, families, and communities to reach their potential for themselves and for their nation. There is a sense of overall purpose in this thinking, which allows you to align efforts across a wide range of activities to create the future we actually want, instead of being the victim of a chaos of public policies which endlessly take us around in endless circles. This overarching sense of purpose is at the core of our work, but because of the power of the status quo, the way things are always done, translating that into action has not been easy. We have started with a call to redefine value. Traditionally, value was defined as outcomes over costs, but it's normally simplified to value for money, which in turn has been simplified to getting as much as you can for as little as possible. That's been our world, and now we are paying the true price of that. Value for money has delivered us $40 billion worth of leaky homes, moldy buildings at Middlemore and elsewhere, and many other short-term outcomes that come with long-term liabilities. Our group, the Sustainable Health Sector National Network, alongside Ora Tayo, the Climate and Health Council, have achieved some significant wins over the last few years. I have to say, helped enormously by the Associate Minister of Health, Julianne Genta, who holds the unique portfolio of health and climate change in the built environment. Our byline has been leadership, advocacy, and action. And together we have seen letters of expectation from the Minister of Health to DHBs and procurement agencies, specifically calling for regard for the environment and all they do, but not yet for targets. Most DHBs are now working together. 12 have joined Toitu EnviroCare, and we together have reduced carbon significantly across those DHBs. The Ministry of Health are now actively promoting and assisting DHBs in this work. And together with the Health Design Council, the big architecture firms and engineers, we have persuaded the Ministry of Health to adopt an investment approach to capital investment in health, and maybe that will become the norm for all government departments. The wheels in the public sector turn slowly, and we have fought hard for every step forward, but that is the nature of change. My sense is that if we were to combine forces, as Nikki says, be more strategic and play a much tougher game, we would do a lot better. That's our challenge, and now in this COVID-19 world is the time for that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Many thoughts there for people to take on, and to again, you can look back on the Facebook recording to go through that. I've got lots of questions coming in as well, and so we can kind of go to those now and look to the panel. So we've got three of our speakers. We've got David, Nikki, and Rachel all on the line, and we're just going to bring them back up for you and start putting out some of these ideas and see if we can throw some ideas around and get some solutions. First one I've got, which is kind of the million-dollar question and should take us through to 1 o'clock on its own, really, is how do we take all this and then sort of transform our lives? What are the practical steps we can take now to actually, shift that change, or to kind of grab onto and hold on to some of that stuff we experienced during the lockdown?
How do you want to direct that traffic?
I'm up for the moment, one who's most eager. Rachel, you can go for it.
Okay, I absolutely believe in modelling behaviour. I think it's one of the most fundamentally important things that we can do, is we can change ourselves, and the way that we do it, if you can demonstrate it's doable, others see it's doable and they copy us. I'd say that's the most important, and there's just thousands of things we can do, from taking your plastic bags, to riding bikes, to walking more, to Zooming and not flying, there's just endless modelling.
I think, shall I butt in?
Sure, Nikki, go, yeah.
Because to me, I agree with you, Rachel, absolutely. I think, that in ourselves, to be people of integrity moving forward in this world, we really need to walk the talk. And then other people also see and are inspired by that. But what I'm most interested in is these conversations that I think we can have in terms of putting this into practice. And I feel like in every context, there's these little edge moments that you can get in there and say, perhaps we could do it this way. So I know that one.
Well, I'm just going to switch over to David because, Nikki, you're breaking up just a touch. David, your thoughts on this?
Look, I think we need action at all sorts of different levels here. So, you know, we need individual action and collective action. And I think that there are different roles for different people within society, you know, and I'm a public servant, you know, and I think there's a huge role for government. There's a huge role for government here to actually have a plan. You know, a coherent plan with a defined, measurable outcome. And I don't see that. I see an aspiration, you know, but I don't see the plan behind it. I don't see how the different bits of public policy align together to take us in the direction we want to go. What we see is 2 steps forward in one direction, 2 steps backwards in another. You know, so, you know, there needs to be some coherence here around how the government approaches this. And it's got a huge leadership role, and they're probably the most significant leaders we've got to motivate and lead the rest of New Zealand society to do that. That said, you know, I look with enormous envy towards the private sector, to your members, Rachel, you know, to the members of the Climate Leaders Coalition and the incredible work that's being led by them, you know, and what they need are the signals. They don't need to be told what to do. They just need the signals. And we're not setting an aligned set of signals for them to accelerate in the way that they can. So that's how I sort of see it.
Sure thing, and that follows on to the kind of, we've got an election in under 3 months. What are the sort of signals we need to be sending to those politicians out there as they go into the hustings? Nikki, well, I'm glad to see you back. What do you think?
Well, maybe I can just, I'm not quite sure where I stopped, but can I just finish that example of the, you know, that example of internet conferences I think I was talking about? Because what I'm always looking for is these little edges. So one of the ideas that intrigues me is, yes, we have international internet conferences, but instead of all sitting in our bedrooms connecting, we actually have local hubs so that we connect at a local level in person and over the internet internationally. So to me, that question of what do we do now is we look for these opportunities that bring together you know, those things that human beings need, which is connection and so on, with some of these technological solutions. And I don't think you can sort of advise people exactly what to do other than to be open for these possibilities and always thinking what promotes well-being and what promotes environmental health.
That seems crucial, the differentiation between what we want and what we need. You know, that's part of that choice thing, Yeah. So Rachel, and the other things that sort of, how do we get beyond that kind of personal responsibility and into the communal and the political realm? How do we get, is it the sort of citizens' assemblies? Do we need to change our democracy and the kind of frameworks and structures we're using?
Yeah, I mean, I find this really interesting because I think if we had climate change communicators communicating the way that we did with COVID, we would have been changing the system radically now. I think one of the things that I noticed for myself during this process is when we were in lockdown, I was super clear, and that's a little bit of the conversation I think that Nikki, you were making about the paradigm of choice. During COVID, there was very little choice. We were told what we could and couldn't do. It was super clear. And I guess for me, imagine if we were doing that same thing around government leadership or leadership from someone like our Prime Minister, Jacinda, saying climate change is really important. Access is really important and fair distribution is really important to New Zealanders. Here's the rules from now on. That would be extraordinarily helpful. However, we then hit with that conundrum, which what David was talking about, which is the people who have a lot right now are not very interested in sharing. So particularly as we enter into a time where there is a sense that we're not going to have much because we're hitting an economic crisis. So people tend to pull their resources tighter and just look after their lot. So we get less keen to share, but I think we have to break that model because that just isn't going to work. I personally don't want to live in a country where I have to step over homeless people and feel shit about it every day. I would like to think that as a nation, we enable conversations with our families, with our organisations we work in, and just be allowed to voice up things which we've kind of not been allowed to say. Our economy is fundamentally screwed if we're relying on tourism from offshore people in vast numbers to come here and create rubbish, pollute our waterways, pollute the skies. That's not going to work for the long run. You know, there's a whole rethinking we need to do. And I think, you know, we're going to have to do it at all levels, including having some strong political leadership.
Yeah, Nikki, you've done a lot of work on the sort of psychology and mindset shifts that are required and that sort of positive framing and into communities of practice. Can you speak on that a little bit, how you kind of take it from the individual to the group and community?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I do a lot is these exercises on what do we value. And my sort of key question here isn't what do you value individually as if you're some kind of unique person, but what do we as a human collective value? And it's always the same thing. It's belonging. It's contribution. It's the natural world. You know, these sort of core things are in all kind of human hearts, souls, bodies, whatever you want to call it. And, you know, the way I think about differences in values is not so much differences in understanding what it takes to thrive, but almost like different areas of priority. So Rachel's always often calls herself a tree hugger, and I can sort of rely on her to hug the trees, which I might not do, but you know, David might actually look after human health, but gosh, I'm glad they're both doing it. So I think once we have these conversations in which we talk about what are our values, we get that trust needed to take these big moves that Rachel's mentioned. I actually think people want to contribute. I don't just think this. There is so much research. There is just so much evidence for it. And for example, if the government did, Rachel, you articulated that so well, this, hey folks, climate change is happening. These are the rules. I think we'd actually all be enormously relieved and want to go along with them. People who have excess wealth actually find that uncomfortable a lot of the time. Now, we have stories and discourses that say, oh, no, you deserved it. But in your heart of hearts, what does it feel like to have all the stuff next to somebody with nothing? I just don't think for most people that even begins to feel good.
Is that your experience?
Andy, just with respect to the discussion around the election, it's kind of interesting that, you know, I think that, you know, you talk elections, you talk politics, you drive people into corners, you know, and so it can be a kind of fruitless kind of discussion. My sense is that, to follow on from both of you, Rachel and Nikki, this issue of values is incredibly important. You know, New Zealanders have a view of ourselves. We have a particular view of ourselves individually and collectively. There may be some discrepancy between the reality and the view, but I think that the view that we have of ourselves is genuinely one of, it's quite an admirable view of who we are, our place in society, the place of this little nation at the bottom of the world, our influence, you know, our innovation, all of those fabulous things. The fact that once we were clean and green, you know, all of those things, and we project well onto the world stage. So, you know, what is it that can we close that gap? How do we want to be seen by people from the other side of the world? What is the kind of country we want to leave to our children and our grandchildren? These are the kind of big motivating questions that we need to be considering when we walk into that little box, you know, on the 17th of September, or do a vote beforehand if you do a vote beforehand. But, you know, and these are the discussions that we should be having every day, actually. You know, they're not just election week discussions, they're everyday discussions. You know, I'm going to say something a bit cheeky here. You know, I remember I was working in Samoa in 2016, and it was the year of the flag discussion, you know, and, you know, it was amusing to me, disappointing too, and, you know, incredibly annoying that we chose to have a discussion about a flag instead of having a discussion about who we were. You know, and I think that would be a much more useful discussion if we were to have that. Who are we as a people? What do we aspire to be? How will we get there? What's our plan? That's the discussion we need to have. And we can start that, and we are talking about it now. And, you know, this is a discussion that's going to go on should go on for a while. And we need lots of people to facilitate those discussions with our friends at dinner parties, you know, when we give public talks or lectures to ask those questions of people. And, and maybe there'll be a little bit of a, we'll start a little movement here.
Sure, and particularly in the current context, like how can we have that discussion properly without kind of really grappling with the colonial past and the colonial present?
I was sitting on one of those advisory groups through COVID with one of the councils, and one of the women who runs the DHB said we should be framing all our responses using a TL Māori framing to make sure, because particularly in terms of health, but also in terms of access, in terms of overcrowding, in terms of population that are really not being cared for well enough in our country at the moment. Imagine if we were using that as a point of reference in some of those decision makings, and also building on that, thinking about if we deeply believe that we are part of a system and part of our natural systems, and if we're screwing up our natural systems, we're also affecting our own health. Let's include that as a lens, not as an economic framing, because our current economic model is so flawed. We know that already. If you have a war, your economic value goes up. I mean, who wants to create wars to get better return? That just seems completely nuts to me. But imagine if we had a more holistic framing for this, what we decided was great country wealth, much wider than just financial returns. I think, yeah, the issues are huge, but we can do it. We're one of those countries that gets to, we're small enough, we can connect across, we can talk to the Prime Minister if we want to. That's pretty unique. And we're also big enough to actually model a change in behaviour. So, yeah.
David, how are you seeing the kind of holistic framing in the health sector kind of playing out? Is it something that's kind of left on the shelf, or how's it kind of getting to touch down on the ground?
Well, it's quite interesting. We've just received the Heather Simpson report into the future of the health and disability sector. It's a report that was commissioned at the beginning of the term of this government, actually looking at the future of health and disability services. It's kind of interesting because, actually healthcare has a relatively tenuous relationship with health and well-being, because actually, healthcare tends to be treating things when they've gone wrong. It doesn't necessarily, it's not the Western model traditionally hasn't been out there to promote health and well-being. It's not its foundation. And, that's been one of the big criticisms of the Simpson report, actually. It's a good report, I have to say, with respect to healthcare services, but it doesn't address in the comprehensive way that we expected, the 80% contribution of the social determinants to our overall health and well-being, and that's what needs to happen. So what we're saying now is that there needs to be a health in all policies. In actual fact, that there's got to be a health lens put across the whole of government, actually, and housing and income and all sorts of different things. And that's the only way we're going to actually really address some of these problems, because you can't fix it in a doctor's room, and God only knows you cannot fix it in the ICU at Middlemore Hospital.
Absolutely true. Visit. And we're just coming towards the end of our time. So I just want to give each of you speakers just a chance to say kind of the one thing that you think, if you want people to put down the screen and go and do something now to kind of move this on in a really tangible way, what would you recommend? I'm willing to take hands because you might need a little bit of thought time, but who would like to speak? Otherwise, I'll come up with something.
I can start. Oh no, you go, Rachel. I was going to start muddling through.
I was trying to say, sorry, Nikki. I wanted to hear what you thought.
You've thrown a line to Nikki.
Well, shall I? I want to come back to this idea of organisations. We've moved into the big picture, and absolutely, I think there's big picture work to be done here. But I think almost all of us in our organisations actually have the capacity to make real change, because we're actually directly involved in those and a part of decision making, and decisions are being made now in this post-COVID era. So I'd sort of urge everyone out there to enter into those conversations and to try and do it as authentically and bravely as possible, not to just go with what's being said, not to do a very what's the word, a sort of simplistic association, such as everyone should be allowed to work from home because it saves commuting, it saves carbon emissions, so it's good for the planet. You know, there's so much around working from home that's so much more complex than that. So I'm just really urging everyone to go back into that experience, to think from the sort of heart, soul, behaviour, embodied person, and to take the opportunity to be part of these conversations, because I think that is one thing we can all do now.
Can I just chip in there, Andy? I want to reinforce what Nikki's saying, but you know, for me, it's really about strategic advocacy. You know, and in our own organisation, Counties Manukau, we've made some significant progress. You know, a lot of it actually has been quite hard work, I have to say, and it still is because of the pressure of funds and various things. The health sector across the board has made some significant progress because we've joined together. Various organisations have made individual progress. We need to get together and actually be much more strategic together in our advocacy and not take no for an answer. And we need to be very clear and very firm and quite relentless in our pursuit of what we want. We've got to be, you know, we've got to play a tough game here. And so it's an organizational issue, I reckon.
Cool. And I think for me personally, you've got to work from the things that really motivate you. So if you're somebody who's really motivated to influence government, then that's the role you should focus on, but make sure you're talking from your truth. So authentic influence is also really important. Or if you're somebody who isn't interested in lobbying government and you just want to practice and demonstrate things, there are so many things, from how you go from mobility through to what the food that you're choosing to eat, all of those things, people see what you're doing. So don't believe that you're invisible. You are in fact visible. And I think the other thing is there's a bunch of skills that we need to kind of utilize now, which were not skills that we learned before. I grew up when Monopoly was a very popular game. It's a neoliberalist, cash-grabbing, horrendous game where we win and lose. Whereas a game where you learn some skills around collaboration, you learn how to influence, and you learn a greater care, I think are the skill sets we need now, because this whole race to the top and pull the ladder up behind you is an absolutely flawed skill set. And we've got too many people thinking that's the skills we need to cultivate. And it's absolutely not. Yeah, so I think you really need to focus on what drives you, authentically drives you, and where you can influence, because we all influence in different ways.
So imagine, start from where you are and get out there and really grapple with those things, the levers you've got some control of. And I think, you know, none of us are doing that to the fullest extent that we can, and gather with others of like mind, you know, that's what David's pointing to, you know, organize and, you know, and use the power of many to make those changes. It's not necessarily reaching out with politics, but it can be, but also just the politics of the here and now and the locally to you. Thanks very much to everyone that's come along, and thank you for your time. Thank you, Nikki, Rachel and David, for your insights this afternoon. They are still available on Facebook, and that'll be up there for a while, and we've recorded it so you can go back and look at it at your leisure. Thanks to our partners for this event, Auckland District Health Board, University of Auckland and the Medical Assurance Society, and look out for some of our coming events. Our next event is on the Circular Economy Office, so the way you can transform the way that your office is set up, and if you're refurbishing an office, to use less materials and really change the surroundings around you, because that's part of this too. That's with George Walker's Office Furniture and Junk Run, and that's on the 30th of June 2020. Have a fantastic rest of your lunchtime, and thanks for spending the time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.
Andy.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers all.